Hey friendlies, it's Tuesday and this week I have another As I See It video for you. Today is part 2 of the fact-checking series that I started last week. The video got really long, so I cut it in 2. And I'm going to start off by giving you a preview of what we covered last week. So the first couple minutes are just highlights from last week in case you missed it. And I'll put the video link up here. So you might want to start there because there's really some foundational information about fact checking. But without much further ado, let's get started with tonight's As I See It. Enjoy. Thanks for being here. We all have biases. To deny that you are biased is to deny your humanity. We're all biased. Not only is it there's also cognitive bias. And a cognitive bias is a systemic error in thinking that affects our judgment. It affects our decisions. And that's why it's so important to take a look at our own personal biases, our own cognitive biases, the things that we have experienced. How is that affecting our judgment and our thinking today? So these biases help us make sense of the world, but they also influence the way we see the world. So while our brain is making shortcuts to help us process information, the flaw is that we start to see the world in that way. We start to see all Trump supporters as legitimizing assault on women. We start seeing all feminists as angry, mean women who are going to yell at me when I'm just trying to. So what emotions are driving your cognitive bias? And this is a tough one because we get so emotionally tugged online every single day by the memes. I think that's a problem. One of the biggest problems I think we have in the country right now, and why there is so much divisiveness, is because I don't think any of us are willing to own our personal biases, our personal and cognitive biases. We want to make everybody else believe that our personal biases are truth. Once you become aware of your own biases, then you can start checking yourself in different situations. Is this my cognitive bias? If you can become aware and start exploring that, that's one step closer you get to this truth. Start becoming aware of the factors that contribute to that bias. Is it what you're watching? Is it who you're listening to? Is it who you're surrounding yourself with? Is it what you're reading? What are the contributing factors that are upholding and affirming and keeping in place, desperately keeping in place that bias? And a confirmation bias helps us continue to feel special by denying things that don't agree with our view of us being special. It doesn't agree with our worldview. It doesn't agree with our brain's attempt to process information to make sense of the world. So the internet feeds this confirmation bias. The social media feeds our confirmation bias if we let it. And I'm going to give some tools here in a little while for how we can start expanding our horizons and maybe getting away from some of these biases and finding the truth. If we can never say I was wrong in the face of the data and the facts, we are never going to find this. We're never going to find this truth. We're always going to be stuck in our truth. We're never going to find the truth.
There ain't nobody gonna do it for you. Got to find your own.
Okay, so now that we are aware of our own biases and what we bring to the table, how do we find truth? How do we fact check? In the day of so much polarization and so much misinformation and the land of talking heads and pundits and journalists and anybody with a camera talking, how do we find truth? How do we separate fact from fiction? In the old days, like I said, we would go to the library, we'd research books, we'd rely on the expertise of the people who wrote the books, because I guess we assumed that you had to have some credibility, you had to have some credentials to get published. Maybe that was true. Today, it's not true. Like I said, anybody with a blog, anybody who has a computer or a smartphone can go on and start spouting opinions. Remember the 6 o'clock news? I mean, that's all we had for the whole time I was growing up. All we had was Walter Cronkite, or was Barbara Walters later, or Dan Rather, the 6 o'clock news. Everybody tuned in for a half hour. It was like a half hour of local news and a half hour of national news every night, and that was our news. And nobody questioned the validity of that news. Nobody questioned the political affiliation of Walter Cronkite. To my knowledge, I don't know if did anybody ever accuse him of being, a liberal media bias? No, he reported the facts. That's how we grew up. Well, all that changed on June 1st, 1980, when CNN became the very first 24-hour news station. And not far behind was Fox News, who said, yeah, I think that was when it really started. CNN is left-wing bias, so we need a voice for the conservatives, and that's how Fox News started. And so with the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, all of a sudden, and different channels for different points of view and different spin on things, all of a sudden news didn't become Walter Cronkite at 6 o'clock with fact-based news. It became a channel or a network's spin on the news. And so it has become extremely difficult for many of us to figure out what's real and what's fake. A recent Pew Research study found that Republicans overwhelmingly trust Fox News, one single news source, for all of their information at 65%, and I think the other 3 or 4 were like 30%. So Republicans overwhelmingly trust one news source for all of their information. Democrats, on the other hand, rely on several. I think it was the top one was like CNN, I think it's 67%, but then the next one was 60% and 60% and 60%. It also shows that Republicans and Democrats are extremely polarized in where they get their information and how they get their information. And Democrats view Fox News as completely unreliable, and Republicans view MSNBC as completely unreliable. And so there's just this polarization and this butting ahead of information. There's a couple things that I want to point out about how we get our news today, especially on television and in newspaper. According to Business Insider, 62% of Americans believe that the news that we get on television, in newspapers, and on the radio is biased. And 80% of Americans believe that the information we get on social media is biased. But when you break it down by political affiliation, Democrats believe that 44% of the television, radio, and newspaper news we get is biased. Republicans believe, what do you think this number is? Republicans believe that 77% of the news we get on television, newspapers, and radio is biased. Now, many of you Republicans are saying, well, that's because the media is biased liberally, that, it's a liberal media bias. That's why liberals don't think it's biased, because it's biased in their favor. So I know many of you are going to say that, but hold on a second. Let's talk about that. So let's talk about, what does it mean to be biased? What does it mean for a news source to be biased? It means that they are putting a spin on the news story based on their confirmation bias, maybe based on their cognitive bias, right? Based on whatever bias, whatever motivation is behind that, whatever network, they are putting a spin on a news story. And I'm going to show you an example here of the different spins that the different news sources put on the same story. So Fox News is still saying that the protests in Portland are violent, they're meant to be violent. MSNBC, who has a left-wing bias, says this is about the same day, that the protests are getting more peaceful, that things are starting to calm down now that the secret police are out of there. And one of the most, according to a study of 1,400 Americans, rating the least biased and most biased news sources, those Americans said that the least biased news sources are PBS and the AP, the Associated Press. The most biased news sources, according to these 1,400 random Americans, were Fox News and Breitbart. They were tied for the bottom. And I just want to be fair. I want to say that the third one from the bottom was MSNBC. And so you'll see here, though, that the Associated Press, one of the least biased news sources, according to the study of Americans, says Portland protests are getting more calm since the secret police left. So you can see here how the different news sources put different spins on the same story. The problem is that anybody can do confirmation bias. They can find the 1 in a million person who's going to say, yeah, we believe in violence. They don't necessarily fact check to make sure they are part of the Black Lives Movement. They don't care, because it's confirming their bias, right? So the thing, though, that I think it's really important for us to understand, and I'm going to put a link to a lot of the fact-check sources. I'll name them really quickly here. According to Middlebury Libraries, there's a link below, the top most accurate fact-check sites are factcheck.org, Fact Checker, which is a Washington Post fact-checking organization, PolitiFact, Snopes, and PunditFact. PunditFact is fun because you can go there and you can fact check the different pundits that you watch. And I will say, as an aside here, I was extremely disappointed to see that Rachel Maddow is not as accurate as I thought she was. She's still pretty accurate, but there have been some falsehoods in some of the stories that she has said. So this is me being willing to look beyond my cognitive bias, looking beyond my confirmation bias, and look for truth. I want truth. I don't want just my truth. I want truth. So I was willing to fact check Rachel Maddow, MSNBC, Chris Hayes, all the other people on MSNBC that I love. I was willing to go and fact check them and accept the fact that, okay, when I listen to them from now on, I might have to do some more independent fact checking. So are you willing to do the same thing for some of your favorite pundits? But there's another point to that I'm going to talk about in a minute. MSNBC is not my only source. So many Republicans, 65%, rely on a single source for news. Most Democrats, myself included, rely on multiple sources. I go to multiple sources, even sources that lean right, because I want to know. I want this. I want this truth. Let's talk about accuracy versus bias. Just because a news source is biased does not mean it's not accurate. There are journalists out there, and they might do a headline, a sensationalist headline, but the basic facts of the story could still be accurate. So it's important to not write off a source just because it leans a certain way. From everything I have seen, anything that's far left or far right is not accurate. They peddle conspiracy theories, they peddle chaos, they peddle sensationalism, and there are some left-wing sources I've banned from my view. I don't want to see them because they spread lies. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. But I'm talking about the center or left of center or right of center. Most news sources that fall in that, they may have a slight bias or maybe even a little bit more than slight, but that doesn't mean that their stories are completely lies or fabrications or falsehoods or inaccurate. So it's really important to take responsibility, do some research, understand what you're watching, what you're listening to, what you're reading. And just because, if you're a Republican, just because it leans a little left doesn't mean it's fake news. They might put their left-wing spin on it, but that does not mean it's fake news. And the same for me. I've learned some things from some more right-leaning publications lately. And it's really important to understand the difference between accuracy and bias, because they're not the same. Another difference when we're talking news that I think it's really important to understand is the difference between a journalist and a pundit, or a talking head. A pundit is someone who expresses opinions. They aren't journalists. They're not out there doing research, citing sources. They're not out there looking to get to the truth necessarily. They are expressing opinions. Some of the most well-known political commentators of our times are pundits. They are not journalists. They don't fact check. They don't check sources. They just spout opinions based on what they think they know. And that's why when I started the series, I thought it was really important to do the research and cite my sources. It's so easy to spout off about what we think we know. But in doing my research, I learned I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. Rachel Maddow, for example. And so that's what the pundits do. They don't fact check. They just talk. They just talk about what they think they know. Some examples of political pundits: Glenn Beck, Bill Maher on the left, Bill O'Reilly on the right, Ann Coulter on the right, Sean Hannity, pundit, not journalist, Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson. It's really easy to believe that many of these pundits are journalists, are giving you real fact-based stories when they're on television news shows that have news in the title. So Sean Hannity, for example, on Fox News, it's really easy to believe that he's a journalist, that everything he talks about is fact, that he has sources and has fact-checked those sources for all of his information. But he's not. He's a pundit. His whole job on Fox News is to express opinion. In fact, has anybody seen the Roger Ailes documentary, I think on Showtime? In the beginning of Fox News, I haven't verified this, it's in the documentary, which they say was based on tons of interviews of people who worked with Roger Ailes. But when Sean Hannity was first brought on to Fox News, Sean Hannity struggled in an interview with a Democrat because the Democrat challenged him with facts, and Hannity stumbled because he didn't have the facts to debate him. And Roger Ailes pulled him back afterwards and said, "We're not watching you for facts. People are watching you because it's you. Just say whatever. It doesn't have to be true." Roger Ailes, allegedly, according to this documentary, that's what he said, and that's the foundation on which Fox News was built. So it's really easy to believe that pundits are journalists and that they're giving, and I don't mean to pick on Fox News here. I'm sure there are pundits on MSNBC too. I just couldn't find any in my research. I researched conservative and liberal pundits, and I could only find the ones that I already mentioned. So I don't mean to pick on Fox News, but Sean Hannity is the one that kept coming up. And I think it is really important for us to understand, though, the difference between journalism and punditcy. Punditcy? I don't know. Punditcy, I like that word. Watch that documentary if you haven't seen it on Showtime about Roger Ailes and the foundation of Fox News, and the fact that Roger Ailes just wanted a voice for conservatives, but it didn't necessarily have to be this. It just had to be what appealed to emotions, what appealed to cognitive bias, what appealed to personal bias, and he wanted to provide confirmation bias to those other biases. Does that make sense? It's important to understand, number one, the difference between accuracy and bias and pundency, I don't know, versus journalism, okay? And the next time you're listening to your favorite news person, are they talking opinion? Are they backing up what they're saying with sources and resources and facts and data and studies? And if so, check those data and studies and facts and make sure that they are in true factual. And when we are engaging with our favorite news sources, whether it's television or online or newspapers or radio, I think it's really important to ask, what is the motive behind this information? Is it truly to inform, or is it something else? Is it information for the sake of information, for educating, or is it meant to outrage? Is this person trying to appeal to my personal bias by inciting emotion, outrage, fear? There's a lot of that online. Online and on TV. There's a lot, and everybody is guilty of this. The fear-mongering. Just look at some of the headlines. For some reason, the media wants to keep us afraid because fear sells. I know that. And you know what? I can't blame the media for that. I mean, the media wants views. I see that in my own videos. Whenever I put something fearful or sensationalized in the title or the thumbnail, that video gets so many more views, and then and then it's so funny. I'll get 100,000 views on that fear-based thumbnail, but it's a real situation. I don't think it's clickbait because it's a real situation. I might be sensationalizing it a little bit. And then that video will get 100,000 views. A typical video might get 20,000 views of my fun, my non-fearful, non-sensationalized. And then every time I do a video about fear and it gets 100,000 views, the 80,000 who only watch those videos, of that 80,000, they'll be like, "You're such a drama queen. All you ever post is drama." Well, it's because it's all you ever watch. You only watch the drama videos. You don't watch the 90% of my videos that aren't drama. We are addicted to drama. We are addicted to fear. And I see that on my own channel, and it's just kind of astounding. It's really interesting to see it on a regular basis. But that's what the media does. The media needs to sell advertising. They need clicks. They need to sell papers. They need to sell advertising on TV. And so they have found that the formula for that is because you and me are susceptible to sensationalism and fear. So it's important to understand then when we are engaging with our sources for information to ask, what is their motive here? Are they truly trying to inform me, or are they trying to incite my emotions to get me emotionally engaged so that I only watch that one news source? What are they trying to sell me here? What are they really trying to sell me here? And why are they trying so hard to tap into my emotion? What is that about? And is that really what's true? So that's the media environment that we are in right now, as far as as far as television, but even things that we read on the internet. How do we find the truth? Okay, so now that we have determined our own biases and we have kind of taken a more maybe objective look at the news sources where we get most of our information, what about all the other information we get? How do we start fact checking the information that we're just flooded with on a regular basis to determine fact from fiction? And there is no easy answer to that. It really does just take research. So and it's also really important to be skeptical. Not only skeptical about the things that you don't agree with, but especially I think about the things that you do agree with. When's the last time one of your sources, if you're a Republican, maybe one of your right-wing sources, or if you're a Democrat, one of your left-wing sources, when's the last time a story came across your feed that you were like, you know what, that just seems ridiculous. I can't. Yeah, it paints, the Republicans or Democrats in a bad light, or a group that I don't agree with. It kind of confirms, it's my confirmation to my bias, but it just doesn't seem right. When's the last time you said that, you thought that, and so then you went to research it and you found out that it in fact was not true? Even though it validated your belief, your cognitive bias, something about it just didn't ring true, and so you researched it, and sometimes it's true. That's happened to me too. Some recent stories about Joe Biden, I looked at it and I'm like, okay, yeah, there is some validity to that, unfortunately. But oftentimes it's like, no, that's just not true. And like I said, I have cut different left-wing sources out of my life because they keep propagating false information. When's the last time you did that? It's important to be skeptical, not only about the things that confirm our biases, but the things that don't. And there is a huge difference between skepticism and cynicism. Believing that there is a deep conspiracy, that all media is biased against you, and that everything that isn't Fox News is lies and falsehoods and fake news, and they just want to brainwash you like they brainwashed all the liberals. And the opposite is true of us liberals, thinking that about all right-wing sources, thinking, oh, they're just conspiracy theories, oh, they're just fake. It's really important to fact check things that even agree with our biases. That's skepticism. But when we are so cynical of anything that doesn't agree with us that we don't even bother to try to check or fact check, that's when we start getting into trouble, and we start living in this truth in our truth instead of the truth. So what can we do? Well, for one, we can start checking multiple sources. Fact check your fact checkers, okay? And don't just go to sites that agree with you. Start exploring, expand your horizons. Start looking at the other side once in a while to see what they have to say. You don't have to listen, if you're a Tucker Carlson diehard, you don't have to listen to Rachel Maddow and vice versa. But go to something center or left or right of center. Don't go way out. Don't go too far out of the center, because then you will start running into more pundit opinions and more appealing to emotional outrage and things like that than you are to facts. But start looking at some of the sources that I have outlined: factcheck.org, Fact Checker, PolitiFacts, Snopes, and PunditFact. Start looking at some of those and start looking for sources outside your normal gathering your normal research and start looking at what the other side is saying. And hopefully we can be open-minded enough to admit when we're wrong, because that's how we grow. That's how we find the truth. Admit that we were wrong. And that's how we start finding truth. That's how we start having better conversations. That's how we start understanding each other. That's how we start ending this polarization, how we start uniting again instead of being so against each other. Again, look at the motives of some of the sources, and are they purposely trying to butt us against each other with their inflammatory language that's saying all the liberals want to take your guns away? How many times have you heard that? Have you actually researched it? Is there any evidence at all of that? And that's just an example. But of all of the, whenever you hear all of the, insert group want to do something to you, you're the victim, it's really important to fact check those. Look at other sources. That's the first step toward credible fact checking, is not just looking at sources that are going to confirm your biases, but looking at sources that are going to challenge your biases. That's true growth. That's a true willingness to get to this truth. That's a true willingness to grow and to evolve and to learn and to be curious. And that's the first step toward credible fact checking, looking at sources that don't agree with you, that don't confirm your own biases. And I have an example for you. I recently heard of somebody left in comments a story, all this misinformation about Black Lives Matter and how violent they are, and it is misinformation. I hope you'll do some research and see that most of the people who are causing violence in the protests do not identify with Black Lives Matter or Antifa, but it is, and you can watch the video. I'll put a link to the video that I did on that up here, but it's other individuals, it's hoodlums and criminals who are looking for an excuse to cause trouble, and in some cases it's white supremacists who are causing violence and blaming it on Black Lives Matter to make them look bad. But I recently saw something from a viewer about a supposed story about Black Lives Matter killing a 4-year-old black girl. And my first thought was, and they were showing this to show just how egregious, how horrible, monster, violent Black Lives Matter is. They're horrible. They just are violent, and they're so horrible they killed a 4-year-old girl. And my first thought was, why? So why would Black Lives Matter, who is trying to promote equality for Black people and to raise awareness for how little Black lives have mattered in this country, why would they kill a black girl? Does that make any sense at all? Why would they kill a little black girl? But I didn't want to just write it off as being fake news. I did the research. I looked for the story. I could only find the story on far right news sources, which a lot of you will say that's because the left-wing media won't cover it because it paints BLM in a bad light. That's cynicism. That's conspiracy theory. I don't believe in that. But what I did see from those news sources, or some of them, is that there was no way to pin it on Black Lives Matter. That there were protests going on in that city, a girl was murdered, but there are lots of people out there committing crimes, and from what I could see, there was really no way to pin it on Black Lives Matter. And so here is the thing. Where's the critical thinking in promoting a story like that? Why would Black Lives Matter kill a black girl? What does that do for their cause? It makes zero sense. And this is what we all can do when we're fact checking and when we're sharing information online, is to ask questions, to get curious and say, why? Why would Black Lives Matter kill a little girl? Why would liberals want to take away all of our guns? Why do liberals really think that everybody should get everything for free and nobody should work? How would that work? How would we have a society if nobody worked? We need to really, I don't want to keep picking on Republicans, or for liberals to say, does it really make sense that every Trump supporter is a racist and hates black people? That every Trump supporter thinks that sexual assault against a woman is okay? Is that really possible, that millions and millions of people still are that racist or really think that it's okay for a man to grab a woman? I find that hard to believe. There must be other reasons they are supporting him. And while I don't understand that, what are some of those other reasons? It behooves us all, I know it's a funny word, behoove. Does that mean to put hooves on cows, I'm going to behoove you. Where did that word come from? But it behooves all of us to ask questions, to dig deeper into the information that, again, is like a fire hose on us every day, and start asking questions. What is the purpose of this video? What is the motive of this video? What is the motive of this story? What's really going on behind the scenes? What are they really thinking? Why would so-and-so do X, Y, and Z? That's the first step toward credible fact checking, is checking yourself and saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. What? That's, thinking before you share things, thinking before you post things, thinking before you just automatically consume what the pundit on TV is telling you, saying, you know what, that doesn't make sense. That, we've gotten intellectually lazy. Neil deGrasse Tyson, we are intellectually lazy. To be intellectually lazy is to automatically believe what somebody tells us without thinking about it, without asking questions, without challenging, without fact-checking, or to automatically disbelieve something that somebody is telling us without asking questions or challenging or fact-checking. So don't be intellectually lazy. No matter what, just ask some questions and dig a little bit deeper. That's how we start fact-checking. Ask questions and dig deeper. So, especially if it's too unbelievable. Why would Black Lives Matter kill a little black girl? That makes no sense. I mean, it makes more sense. It's false, but it makes more sense that Black Lives Matter want to kill white people. That makes more sense. It's completely false, by the way. That's not true. There's 0 ounce of truth in that, but it makes more sense than why would they kill a little black girl? Think, right? And the other thing that we can do to fact check, and I touched on this a little bit, is to look at multiple sources. So even on the fact checking websites that I'm giving you in the video and I'm giving you below, don't just go to one fact checking site. Because I know a lot of you are so cynical and so in the belief that there is a conspiracy to brainwash America into liberal values, that you will think that, oh, I've heard it already, media bias fact check is one of them. Oh, who are they? They're just biased. They're just more left-wing, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think I've given you 5 different fact-checking websites, so check them all. See what they all say. And then find commonalities, find differences. What did I just hear recently in one of the videos that I watched, I'll put below, about how to fact check? When you are trying to fact check a point, a story, no matter what the angle of the story is, you can always find information to validate that story. You can always, no matter how crazy the conspiracy theory is, chemtrails, no matter anti-vaxxing, no matter how crazy the conspiracy theory is, you can always find experts who are going to expound on that and say, yeah, okay, yes, this is real, this is true, no matter what. And I just alluded to this on the Black Lives Matter killing the little girl. The absence of studies, the absence of information, the absence of clarification and validation is almost always a sign that it's fake. Okay, you finding validation of a story that it's true doesn't necessarily make it true, because you could always validate that, there's always ways to manipulate data and people and sources and people into any viewpoint. So finding information to validate a viewpoint doesn't automatically validate it. You have to dig deeper. You have to look at multiple sources. You have to use your critical thinking. But the absence of data to back up a story or a claim often means, almost always means, that it's not true. Does that make sense? So that's another way that you can fact check. Another way to perform fact-checking is to recognize bias, not only in yourself, but the person who is delivering the information to you. Recognize, especially though, your own bias. When you are researching and fact-checking, recognize that you are already coming to the table with a bias and you want a certain outcome, that you're hoping for a certain outcome. I recognize that all the time. It's like, oh, I'm hoping XYZ, and then it's not, it's ABC, and I'm like, oh, crap, well, okay, I have to face the truth. I have to face that fact. So the third part of fact checking is making sure that you recognize not only your own biases going into the research, going into the search, but often the biases of the people around you, the people from whom you're getting the information, who are delivering the information. You have to recognize their biases, their motivations as well. It's extremely important to do that. Practice, practice, practice. The more you research, the more you fact check, the better you're going to get. The more you dive into this, the better you are going to be equipped to recognize false information, conspiracy theories, ulterior motives. The better you get at looking at sources, verifying sources. Who is this? Don't just because he has PhD or she has PhD next to her name doesn't make her credible. Doesn't make her not a whack job. Wasn't there a current doctor who believed in demons and aliens and something? Just because they have PhD doesn't mean that they are mentally well, right? So look deeper. Just don't look at a title. Don't look at a name. Do a Google search. Find out more about that person who did the study or who is promoted as an expert in the field. What are they really about? What are other sources saying about this person and this source and this story? It's really important to get a whole bunch. You want the whole picture. So look at other sources. What are other sources saying about this expert? What are other sources saying about this study? What are other sources saying about this fact or this data? And start putting all of that together, and when you start recognizing the credible sources, and I put a list of credible sources, I think in my last video, I'll put a list of all the most studies have shown, study after study of nonpartisan, non-biased organizations have done research on the most reliable news sources, and I'll put them below. And once you start identifying where to go for the most reliable information, it'll become a little bit easier for you to fact check. But first you have to have some trust, you have to have some faith, you have to let go of some of that cynicism, you have to let go of some of those conspiracy theories and some of those your own biases, and recognize why you're holding on to those and what they mean to you. And so it's really important to look at multiple sources to get a big picture, bring all that information together, and kind of just start forming your own opinion. And that really is what critical thinking is about. That's what college taught me, how to look at some of the classic philosophers, political philosophers of our times, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Adams, and I was forced to read those in college and then come up with my own viewpoints about their opinions. I'm like, you're kidding me. These guys are experts. They're famous. But that's how I learned critical thinking, that I could challenge a classical political philosopher. I could, and it was okay. And sometimes my points, if you can argue a point, if you can debate a point, you can argue with anybody, as long as you back it up with facts and data and reason. And that is what fact checking is all about, pulling all the sources together, multiple sources, not just from one side, not the ones that just confirm your biases, but all sources, coming up with a reasonable and a rational truth based on your own critical thinking. Does that make sense? Finally, the last step toward effective fact-checking is to check your emotions at the door. It's so easy to buy into what we want to believe when our emotions are attached. And emotions are really, really, really high right now about everything, about, to mask or not to mask, about anti-choice versus pro-choice, about, what really is sexual assault against a woman, and Epstein. And their emotions are high about everything right now. So it's probably harder now than almost any time in history to check our emotions when we're fact checking, but it's really, really important. And be prepared and be okay with being proven wrong. That's how we grow. And again, if you can't admit you're wrong, or if you're so invested in your own personal biases that you're not even willing to accept what might be out here, then don't even bother and admit that. And I think that if we can admit that, I think that we would all be in a much better place instead of arguing back and forth when it's not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to change your mind. You're not going to change my mind. I guess agree to disagree, I guess, is the best way to put it, even though I think that's a little bit of a cop-out in a lot of ways. When we go into fact-checking, like Neil deGrasse says, we have to kind of believe in the science. We have to put our faith in the science, because science never lies. And science changes, science evolves with more findings and more discoveries, but science in its very basic bare fact, the earth, the universe, the numbers, they don't lie. It's facts are facts. And we have to kind of remember that there's so much information and data out there now wrapped up in emotion on purpose, right? To keep us like this, to keep us divided, to keep us scared, because fear sells. You know, I really think that's all it is. But there's so much there to keep our emotions tweaked all the time that it's up to us to be responsible and mature enough to recognize that and say, you know what, I'm going to leave my emotions at the door. I want truth. Okay? And one other point I want to make that Neil deGrasse made, we are much, much more invested in a single person's testimony. That means what one person tells us. We're human, our brains are wired for some reason to be much more invested in what one person will tell us versus what 100 points of data will tell us, will say to us. He's an example of going to buy a new car, done all the research, looked at Consumer Reports, did the Edmunds reports. You know the car inside and out. You know that it's safe. You know all the reviews online, all the data that has been compiled say that this is the safest car. This is the best car for you. So you're going in to the auto store to buy the car, and a guy is coming out. I am never buying this car again. The tire fell off. It broke down on the side of the freeway. I'm not buying this car. It's a piece of crap. So all of a sudden, all that research that you did, you spent months doing this research, looking at multiple sources, and you were just determined that this was the car for you. But one guy, a stranger, no less, somebody you don't even know, is bitching up a storm about this car, and all of a sudden you're having second thoughts. This is us. This is humanity. This is the way we are wired. So it's important also to recognize that we believe people over data sometimes. We will believe one person over thousands of data points sometimes. So it's really important, that's the last thing I'm going to talk about today, to be aware. Who are you listening to? And why do we believe that person so much over all of the data over here? So these are all the things that I think are really, really important to keep in mind. Your own biases. I talked about a lot here. This video was a lot longer than I thought it would be, but I talked about a lot here. But I hope this will give you some tools, some insights into helping you find the truth and not just live in your truth. I think if we can all at least try to start poking around here and getting out of here, maybe we can meet somewhere halfway, and I think that we can all start getting along better. The world will be a better place. We can start living in the truth, or at least something closer to the truth, instead of this is true, instead of my truth and never the two, shall meet. We're just going to continue to butt heads. So I hope this really helped you a lot. Stay tuned. There's a lot more as I see it to come, and this is how I see it. This is how I see getting to the truth. This is how I see fact-checking and using the internet for good instead of evil, and using all of the information that's available to us, but discerning motives, discerning truth from fallacy. Okay, so this was fun. I'm sure we were all chatting over here. Leave your comments below. Let me know what you think. Did this help you think about things in a different way? What cognitive or personal biases are you bringing to the table? I'd love to hear that. What biases are you now starting to think about and recognize in your own self that you are bringing to the table when you're fact-checking or researching? And how has it limited your ability to hear or to see or to find that truth? Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I really enjoy these chats with you, and I love hearing from you, and I'm so grateful that all of you are here with me. Be sure to subscribe below. I need all the subscribers I can get every time I do a video like this. No matter how many times I warn people not to watch, I do lose subscribers. So if you like this, subscribe below. I appreciate you. I will see you next time. In the meantime, be happy, be free, and be kind. Mwah! I'll see you soon.